All right, good evening.
Good evening, sir.
We are in John chapter 21 this evening. John chapter 21, as we pick up where we left off last week on the appearances of Jesus after his resurrection. And so last week there's Mary Magdalene who saw him first, and then we saw that he came to the apostles after the road to Emmaus. He came to the apostles that evening, and that everyone was there except for Thomas. And then 8 days later, he came and saw the apostles again. And Thomas, who had been doubting up to this point, is now on board with the other 11 apostles, and he believes. And now we come to John chapter 21, and we find that the apostles have left Jerusalem and they have gone to Galilee. And this actually is what Jesus had been commanding them to do. If you remember, for example, at the end of the book of Matthew chapter 28, that's what they were all told to do. Matthew chapter 28 and verse 10, as he spoke with the women, Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." And so these women then went on and told more than the apostles. They told, it seems, all kinds of people that they were supposed to go to Galilee. And so the apostles too have gone to Galilee to see Jesus. In John chapter 21, it says in verse 1, "After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias." Now, Tiberias is just another name for the Sea of Galilee. And so the Sea of Galilee, of course, is where Jesus spent a lot of time in his ministry. And, there's all those mountains around the Sea of Galilee, and they would talk about him going up the mountain and down the mountain, and he crossed the Sea of Galilee multiple times. And that's where they're at. They're at the Sea of Tiberias. And this, of course, is very close to Nazareth and to the place that Jesus and these apostles all grew up in. So this is close to their hometowns. And it says, "In this way he showed himself," verse 2, "Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together." And so you have here 5 of the apostles by the Sea of Galilee. And we'll learn later, it's Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, James, and John. Those are the 5. Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, James, and John. And they go on what is a familiar sounding, unsuccessful fishing trip. Verse 3, Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." And so they said to him, "We are going with you also." And so they went out and immediately got into the boat. And that night they caught nothing. And we've seen this before. This happened when Jesus called Peter originally. They went out at night, they fished all night long, and they caught nothing. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And he said to them, "Children, have you any food?" And so they answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." And so they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. And so again, we're taking Peter and these men back to their sort of beginning with Jesus. And that when Jesus started calling them to be his disciples, he found them in the boat. He said, "Have you caught anything?" And they said, "No." And then he said, "Cast it in again." And you remember Peter says, "Well, we've been doing this all night, but if you tell us to, we will." And then they catch all of these fish. It's all happening again. "Therefore," verse 7, "the disciple whom Jesus loved." Now that's John. This is how he refers to himself over and over. He never refers to himself by name in this book. He refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. "The disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.' And so when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and he plunged into the sea." John seems to have the greatest faith. Remember, after Peter and John ran to see inside the tomb, and they found it just as the women said, we're told that John believed, and that he's really the only one that believed before he saw Jesus. John is the one who's noticing the parallels between when Jesus called them and today, and he's the one who kind of puts it all together. This is the Lord. But Peter is always the one who jumps into action first. Right? Whenever the women said he's not in the tomb, John and Peter both ran there, but Peter ran faster and he got there first. John says it's the Lord. Peter doesn't wait. He puts his outer coat on and he jumps into the water. He's going to swim to the shore to get to Jesus. In verse 8, the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. And so the other 10 men just, or not 10, right? There's 5 of them total. So the other 4 men just stay in the boat. Peter's going to swim, right? He wants to get to Jesus as quick as he can. And so verse 9, as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there and fish laid on it and bread. Now, this is, what did Jesus just ask them? Do you have anything to eat, right? Do you have any food? And then they get to land, and Jesus clearly doesn't need their food. He's already got his own meal cooking right here. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you have just caught. And so Simon Peter went up, and he dragged the net to land, and it was full of large fish, right? Not teeny tiny minnows. These were the big ones, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. This is the miraculous power of Jesus. He can cause fish to go into the net, even though they weren't doing it otherwise. And the net doesn't break, even though it should. And so Jesus said to them, come and eat breakfast. They've caught all of these fish, but Jesus doesn't need one of their 153 fish. It sort of reminds us of when Jesus fed the 4,000 and the 5,000. He could take just a few loaves and a couple of fish, and he could feed 8 to 10,000 plus people with just that little bit. They've caught 153 fish, but he just, I don't know how he got this fish, but he just makes this fish here, and he's cooking it right there in front of them. You're not going to need those 153 fish. And we're told in verse 14, it says, this is now the 3rd time that Jesus showed himself to disciples after he was raised from the dead. And so the first time was on Resurrection Day, that evening, when Peter got back from the road to Emmaus, he appeared to the 10 apostles. The second time was 8 days later. This starts in John 20:24, when Thomas finally saw him. He didn't believe it until he saw him. Mm-hmm. This is the 3rd time that the apostles have seen Jesus. And it says in verse 12, it says, come and eat breakfast. Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? Knowing, right, no one has any doubts now, knowing that it was the Lord. And Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. This is the 3rd time that they have seen Jesus, at least these 5 men have seen Jesus since he was resurrected. Yes, sir.
Would it be fair to bring up that I think in Luke account, the apostles, upon that first revelation to him, he showed his hands.
Yes.
They got to see that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Thomas was still the doubter or whatever, but we really give him a pretty bad rap. These other ones got the same.
Oh, yeah. They all but John doubted until they could touch it. Thomas is not the only one. He just saw it last. That's why he kind of gets but yeah, we're told that John believed. Of the 11 apostles that are left, John believed. The other 10 had to see it for their own eyes before they believed it.
Apparently Jesus knew that.
Yes. That's right. Yeah, he showed them, and he ate in front of them, and so yeah, I think you're right about that. Right, so Jesus, I think, here is reminding Peter that Peter is not a fisher of fish anymore. That's what he told him originally. No longer will you catch fish; you will be a fisher of men. And I think he's reminding Peter of that now, because Peter knew how to use just a fishing pole. Right? If he wanted to just go relax, if he wanted to just go catch one meal. If he wanted to just sort of, kill some time because he didn't know what else to do while he's waiting for Jesus to come to Galilee, he could have got a fishing pole out. And you can see that in Matthew 17 and verse 27. In Matthew 17 and in verse 27, that's where the enemies of Jesus come and they ask him about paying taxes to Caesar. And so Jesus tells Peter, he says, let's see here, Matthew chapter 17, in verse 27, Jesus says to Peter, he says, lest we offend them, go to the sea and cast in a hook, right? That's one line. That's a fishing pole. Cast in a hook and take the fish that comes up first. And that's, the money was found inside of the fish, and that was going to pay taxes for both Jesus and Peter. I guess the other 11 disciples had to find their own money to pay their taxes. But Peter knew how to just go fishing, but he didn't do that. He took the whole net. Right? He put in a lot of effort to try to catch a whole lot of fish, which means he was going to have to clean all of those fish or whatever he had to do to sell all of those fish. You get the sense that Peter is doing more than just relaxing. Peter is going back to a way of life that he was supposed to have left behind. If he wanted to just relax, he could have taken a fishing pole. He took the whole net. And so he's kind of working himself backwards here. And Jesus reminds him, on your own strength, he couldn't catch anything. On his own strength, he couldn't even catch fish. But with the power of Jesus, he could catch 153 fish, big ones, and the net doesn't even break. And so he's reminding Peter that he's not a fisher of fish anymore, not as a profession, and that Peter needs the strength and the power of Jesus in whatever it is that he's going to be doing. And so starting in verse 15, he's going to set Peter back on the right course. When they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" Now, what, and Jesus is going to ask this 2 times first. He asks, "Do you love me?" That's the Greek, in Greek, there are 4 different words for love. This is the word agape. That's the one we think of, the God love. It's that desire for a wholesome family relationship at any cost, no matter what it takes. It's the kind of love that puts Christ on the cross. And so he says, do you agape love me more than these? And so Peter replies, yes, but it's not exactly yes. He says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Now, he doesn't say agape. He uses the word phileo, which is, we're familiar with it like Philadelphia, a city of brotherly love. Right? He says, "I'm fond of you." Right? I have affection towards you. This is a friend kind of love, not a sacrificial love, a friend kind of love. And so Jesus says, "Do you have a sacrificial love for me?" And Peter says, "I love you, but it's more like a friend would love." Again, or he says at the end of verse 15, he says, "Feed my lambs." Again in verse 16, "Do you agape love me, Peter?" Or Simon. And so he says to him, "Yes, you know that I love you." But again, that's, you know that I have a friend sort of love. And so he says, first he said, "Feed my sheep." Now he says, "Tend my sheep." But then he said to him the 3rd time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" This is not agape this time. This time, Jesus asked if he phileo, if he has a friend kind of love. Are you really fond of me? Do you really love me as friends would love each other? And so Peter was grieved because he said to him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things," right? Right? I don't know why you're asking me these questions. You already know the answer. "You know all things. You know that I love you." And he says there, phileo again, friendship. You know that I have a friendship kind of love towards you. And so Jesus says to him, this is the 2nd time he says this, he says, "Feed my sheep." Now, it stings when he asks him, "Do you friendship love me?" Because, Peter won't admit to having an agape kind of love. Why do you think that is? Why won't Peter admit to having a sacrificial kind of love for Jesus? He denied him. He already had the chance to sacrifice himself for Jesus, and he didn't take it. And so I think he's really trying to be very honest with himself, it seems like. He's saying, I don't know if I can claim to have a sacrificial kind of love for you, Jesus, because when put to the test, I said, "I do not know that man," 3 times, and then the rooster crowed. And so he's saying, I'm very fond of you. We're good friends, Jesus. I've been up and down with you, but I don't know if I could say that I have a sacrificial kind of love. But Jesus wants them to see they're connected. You've got to have both. All right? That's when you get to first, and it's interesting because Peter writes this. This is Peter in 2 Peter chapter 1. 2 Peter chapter 1. it's what we sometimes we call them the Christian graces. And it's sort of that, this builds on that. Add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, perseverance, add to perseverance godliness, and then to godliness he says brotherly love, right? Phileo, the kind that he said he had for Jesus, and then to that kind of love, agape, the God sacrificial kind of love. And so Peter is writing about this, and he's saying you've got to have both. And that's what Jesus is trying to show him, that you can't really have one without the other, not for the kind of relationship that they need, and that Peter is going to have the agape kind of love, because verse 18, he says, most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and you walked where you wished. All right, to gird, that's where they would take their, they wore like long tunic kind of things that look more like skirts than pants, and they would take them and they would roll them up and tuck them into their belts so that they could walk more freely around. So it says, if you wanted to move somewhere fast, you just girded yourself up, right? And you just picked up and you ran. You walked where you want to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, right? And so this is, Jesus had to stretch out his hands to be crucified, You will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you, right? You don't decide where you're going or what you're doing. Someone else decides for you. And they will carry you where you do not wish. And John tells us, and mind you, John is writing this very late in his own life, years after Peter has died. So he knows how Peter dies. He said, this he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. And so saying, you made your mistake, but feed my sheep, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. It's not over for you, Peter. You're not a fisher of fish anymore. You tend the flock. You feed the flock. There's space that Peter made his mistake, but there's forgiveness, and he can get back up, and he can keep doing what Jesus intended for him to do. And so there's forgiveness, and there's room for growth, that he can grow from just having a friendship kind of love to having a sacrificial kind of love, and that he would have later in his life, as he writes about in 2 Peter. And as John tells us, he dies that way. And so yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, when you're old, whenever the ancient people talk about old, they mean 40 and old. Sorry if you're 40 and older, but that they didn't live as long as we do most of the time. And normally, if they talk about a young man, that could be anything from 13 to 40. Old is 40 and older, and so it's not necessarily old in the sense of unable to get around. Stretching out your hands is sort of signifying the idea that of just like they crucified, and that's what Romans did a lot. They crucified people, and so they're gonna, just like Jesus' hands were stretched out so they could nail it to the cross. He's saying they're gonna.
I didn't take it that the way he was going to die. I don't know how you get that out of that verse.
Oh, well, because verse 19 it says, "This is spoken by what death he would glorify God." And so I'm with you, Kenny. If verse 18 was all that was there, I wouldn't be sure what that was about. But John tells us in verse 19 that verse 18 is about how Peter would die. And so, thankfully, the Bible sometimes clarifies for us. It's just exactly what we need to know. And so, and that's why he has to have that sacrificial kind of love, because he is going to die in some sacrificial kind of way. And so Jesus is showing him there's forgiveness, there's room for growth. Maybe you and I don't have an agape kind of love for Jesus yet, but keep striving for it, keep working for it. If Peter could get there with all of his mistakes, we all can get there if we just have faith and keep repenting and keep trying. There's space for that in this, and that's what he says. Follow me. Jesus went to the cross. Peter's going to follow him right there in some way or another. All right, thoughts or comments about what we've looked at so far? Okay.
How many of the apostles did Christ tell us how they were going to die?
This is the only one that is specified that I can think of.
On Acts, Peter.
That Christ told us. This is the only one that I could think of that Christ told us about. Now, in the book of Acts, chapter 12, we're told that James is beheaded by King Herod. And so we know how James dies. We have some sense at least of how Peter dies. All of the other ones, there's lots of interesting stories that from ancient people that you can read that may or may not be true. But the indication is that probably 11 of the apostles were killed, and John himself is the only one to have lived into old age and to probably died of natural causes. But
Peter's head was cut off like John's.
James's head, yes. Acts chapter 12 tells us that Herod took James the apostle and beheaded him, just like John, yes. And then he also took Peter for the same intention, but that's when the angel came and got Peter out of prison, and he escaped. And so Peter didn't die that day. He died another day. Yes, ma'am. So, all right, picking up then in verse 20. Verse 20, he says, "Then Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved." Right, so that's John the apostle. He saw John, and it says he was following. Right? Apparently they're walking by this point and talking about these things. And it says, "This is the one who had leaned on his breast at the supper," right? The one who was closest to Jesus at the Last Supper. That's John. And said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" And so this is how John is telling us who the one whom the disciples loved is, because the other gospel accounts tell us John said those things, John did those things. And Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "But Lord, what about this man? Right? What about him? Right? That's how I'm going to die. What about this guy? He wants to go down the list and know about everybody's future." And verse 22, Jesus said to him, "If I will that he remains until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." And so Jesus' point there is, right, you worry about you. Being faithful yourself is enough work for one person without worrying about somebody else, right? You worry about your path. You follow me and influence others to follow me. Don't worry about what's going to happen to him. Apparently, though, this became sort of a rumor, and people started saying, well, Jesus is going to come back before John the Apostle dies. And so here, close to the end of his life, John tells us, he clarifies in verse 23, "Then this saying went out among the brethren, that the disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you?" Right? So he's just using it as an example. Right? For all you know, Peter, he's going to be here till the second coming. Don't worry about that. But apparently people took that saying and they read more into it than Jesus meant. And so before John dies, he's trying to make sure people, right, that would be pretty hard on people if they believed that Jesus would come back before John dies. And then John dies. What would that do to people's faith? This is all a scam. It's all a lie. He was not supposed to ever die. He's clarifying here. That's not what Jesus said. It's just, he was just making a point. Focus on you. And so verse 24, "This is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things." Right? I was there. I saw Jesus talking to Peter. I touched his hands myself. I touched his side myself. And we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which, if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Amen. In other words, in his short 33 years on earth, Jesus did so many things that you could write about it ad nauseum and never reach the end of those things. It's the same thing that it's actually very parallel. I can't help but feel like John had to be thinking about this. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 12. At the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, when he's written all of this wisdom down, he says in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 12, "And further, my son, be admonished by these," right? This is enough. "Be admonished by what I've given you. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh." In the Bible, we feel that sometimes. Much study is wearisome to the flesh. But that's he's saying, I'm not going to write any more about this. What I've given you is plenty to go on. You don't need any more about this. And then verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Right? That sums it up. That's enough. That's what John is saying here. He says we could write forever and ever about the things that Jesus did, but we've given you enough. We've given you enough to know that what you need to do is, verse 22, follow me. Follow Jesus wherever it takes, even if it costs you your life. Follow Jesus there. Believe on the things that he did. Chapter 20, verses 30 to 31, he says, we wrote these things that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Those 4 gospel accounts, they're enough to prove it, to show us, to teach us who Jesus is. Take what they say, do what he says, follow me, and you will have life everlasting. And so there ends the last of the apostles' accounts of Jesus' life. But that's not the last thing that we know of that Jesus did while he was on earth. Any thoughts or comments on the last part of the book of John here? Yes.
John really talks about the Last Supper a lot here, and especially like where he was in that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was just remembering that he asked the question of Jesus because Peter asked him to.
That's right.
Whenever they were talking, Peter was like, "Hey, John, ask Jesus who it's going to be," and so he does. And it's kind of happened over and over as we've talked about this last few days. John is the one who helps Peter see Jesus.
That's right.
You know, John ran with him to the tomb. John told him, "Hey, that's Jesus." Whenever they're on the boat, you know, John's right there. And I wonder if Peter's, because he's feeling so shaky after the betrayal, he's feeling a little dependent on John. Like, am I going to outlive John? Because that's not going to be good. You know, like he has that need. But Jesus is telling him, you don't need to go through anybody else. Go through me. And I think that can be helpful to us too. Because I think a lot of us can feel that way about, you know, maybe the person who baptized you or your close friends or whatever. Well, I can't be faithful without them. But Jesus is telling you that you have everything you need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. That's just pointing out that when earlier in the book of John, when he was recording the events, and he records more than anybody about the events of the night of the Last Supper, that Peter, whenever Jesus says, one of you will betray me, Peter leans over to John and says, ask him who, because John is sitting closest to Jesus. And that you do see through the book of John that Peter and John are very close, and that especially after Jesus dies, you see John is always right there with Peter and kind of helps him to see Jesus, that they run together to the tomb, and whenever they're in the boat, it's John who says it's the Lord, and from that, Peter jumps into the water, and that perhaps, and I think this is a good observation, perhaps when Peter looks back and says, well, what about John? You know, how's he going to die? He's kind of asking, am I going to outlive him? Because I don't want to. I need John to be faithful to you. And Jesus is in effect saying, you don't, I mean, it's good to have friends, but you don't need him. You need to follow me. And I'm glad John's there for you, but you're going to be faithful whether John is by your side or not. Is that?
I mean, I know it doesn't matter, but I am curious how old are most of the apostles right now? Because if you think about the way they think, I don't know. I guess growing up, I always thought they were a whole lot older, but I don't think.
Probably about Jesus's age. Most of them are his cousins, and they all would have grown up together. And so, you know, you're looking at some maybe in their late 20s, some in their 30s, maybe even late 30s. I can't tell you exactly how old all of them are. Some may be older than that, but they're probably around Jesus's age. And you think Peter probably dies about 30 years later, and so he's probably in his 60s when he dies. That's a good question.
Like a pretty big chore for somebody my age.
Yes, right. That's exactly it. Yeah, I think you're right. But he could do it, and so any of us can. That's good, Zach. Thank you. All right. Let's turn then to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We've been here a couple of times last week because Paul sort of lays out this timeline for us about what did Jesus do after he rose from the dead. we know that in verses 3 and 4, he describes, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And then in verse 5, it says he was seen by Cephas, that's Peter, and that's probably on the road to Emmaus where Peter saw him. And then by the 12, and that's first that night. And he says the 12 there, but you think Judas is dead. And he's probably thinking about Matthias, who will become an apostle later. But that night of resurrection night, and then again 8 days later, so that Thomas is included. And then after that, verse 6, he was seen by over 500 brethren at one time, of whom the greater part remain to the present, although some have fallen asleep. And so Jesus saw more than 500 disciples at one time. And his point here is there's a lot of them are still alive when he wrote this, of course, not today. And so you can go ask them about it yourselves. They'll tell you about the resurrected Jesus. And that's if the law hangs on two or three witnesses, more than 500 witnesses is an overwhelming amount of evidence that what they're saying is true. And I think that it's very likely, verse 7, it says, after that he was seen by James, and then by all the apostles. I think that's describing when he ascended up into heaven. That's that last moment on earth. But I think it's very likely that Matthew chapter 6, verse 6 here, the 500 brethren happens in Matthew chapter 28. Matthew chapter 28, starting in verse 16. Again, this is the same mistake that I had always made. I talked about last week when Jesus gives the Great Commission in Mark chapter 16. I always assumed that was on the day he ascended into heaven. But in Mark 16, it tells us that he told them that at the table, which implies it's probably at one of those occasions where they had dinner with him, the first or the second appearance. I've always made that same assumption here in Matthew 28:16. I've always assumed that this is the moment before he ascended into heaven. But we know that he ascended into heaven from the Mount of Olivet. And you can read about that in Acts chapter 1 and verse 12. In Acts chapter 1 and verse 12, it says that when he was lifted up into the clouds, they were at the Mount of Olivet. The Mount of Olivet is just a little bit outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not in Galilee. But in Matthew 28:16, it says that the 11 disciples went away into Galilee. And so this is a completely different occasion than when he was lifted up into heaven. And remember, that's where Jesus told them to go. And then we read that back in verse 10 of Matthew 28. That's by the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus spoke with Peter and the other 4 apostles. And that was the third occasion. But sometime after that, it seems like Jesus went up on a mountain in Galilee, which it says Jesus had appointed for them. They all knew to go up to this one mountain in Galilee. Very likely, this is one of those same mountains that we read about Jesus teaching the people from, where probably he fed the 4,000 or the 5,000 or something like that. One of these same mountains that he taught from, they're back in that same place again. And when they saw him, it says they worshiped him. And then this is interesting. Some doubted. Now we know at the first meeting with the apostles, 10 of them were there, and they believed after they touched him. At the second meeting 8 days later, Thomas was also there. All 11 are there. They believed after he touched them. And that's why I think that verse 17, it's more than the apostles. And Paul tells us that he saw more than 500 of the brethren at the same time. The 11 apostles seem to believe that Jesus is alive. They've now seen him 2 or 3 times, depending on which ones you're talking about. So I think that some of the doubters are some of those 500 people. And it makes sense. If you were going to see 500 people more than at one time, a mountain is a great place to do that, where everyone can see you. So they go to the mountain. They worshiped him. Some doubted. And Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth." And this is his resurrection has earned him. Now, he already had all authority inherently because he's God. And so as God, it naturally belongs to him. But his death and burial and resurrection has proven to us that he deserves all authority. His death, burial, and resurrection has shown even Satan that he deserves all authority because he had victory over death and therefore victory over Satan. And so he already had all authority, But now it's undeniable. Right? Now there's evidence beyond a shadow of a doubt that all authority has been given to me, he says, both in heaven and on earth. There is nowhere that you can go, not the darkest corner of earth, not the deepest recesses of eternity. There is nowhere that you can go where you can escape the authority of Jesus Christ. Every single person, dead and alive, are accountable to Jesus Christ because all authority, heaven and earth, belong to him. And so with all of his authority, right, he is the king. He can say whatever he wants. Go and make me 1,000 chocolate truffles because I'm hungry and I like, he can say whatever he wants. And this is what he says. Go, therefore, right? Therefore, it's, right, what's that saying? What is it there for? Right? He's drawing a conclusion. The reason why they can go, or why they should go, is because he has all authority. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And so with all the authority in anywhere, he gives his marching orders. And his marching orders are, go make more disciples, save more people through baptism, teach them all of the commands, everything that Jesus taught, teach them all the New Testament. And then the promise that if that's what you're doing, if you are doing that work, he is right there with you. It says it this way at the end of Mark chapter 16, and we'll look at this again next week, but Mark chapter 16 and verse 20, it says, they went out and they preached everywhere, and the Lord, it says the Lord was working with them. He was in heaven, but he was working with them and confirming the words of the accompanying signs, amen. He was working with them then. He's working with us now. He may be there, but he's God. He can work with us here, even as he is there. And so that's now 2 different occasions that he has said this to the apostles. He said it in Mark 16:14 while they sat at the table. And now he said it again in Matthew 28 on the mountain in Galilee. Right? Of all the things that Jesus told the apostles after he rose from the dead, this is what's repeated. It seems like he's saying it every time he sees them. He is saying this again. This is what your life purpose is. If you're going to follow me, this is your life purpose from now on. Go, make disciples, baptize them in the name of, right? That is, if he has all authority, it doesn't get bigger than the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Baptize them in all of the authority, all the power that God is, and then teach them to obey all the rest of those commandments. This is what he's repeating to them. This is our life purpose. This is their life purpose moving forward, with the assurance that if you are doing that, he is right there working with you. All right, thoughts or comments about that? We have now looked at every scripture concerning Jesus' appearances to the disciples after his resurrection. And I've tried to do it in chronological order to the best of my ability. I've tried to put them in chronological order. And next week, we are going to be looking at the actual ascension of Jesus. We're going to focus on the day that he did go up into heaven and some of the things that happened on that day. But we have just a couple of minutes. Are there any last comments or anything like that? If not, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Johnny.